The dawn of July 14th, 1822, broke over Charleston with a blood-red sky that seemed to prophesy the horror that awaited discovery. The humid South Carolina air hung thick with an acrid smell that would haunt Magnolia Grove plantation for generations to come. The stench of burned flesh and smoldering timber that no amount of magnolia blossoms could mask. Cornelius Whitmore stepped onto the grand veranda of his plantation house, adjusting his silk waistcoat as he prepared for his morning inspection of the grounds. At 43, Whitmore commanded respect through fear rather than admiration, his pale blue eyes as cold as winter frost despite the oppressive summer heat. His meticulously groomed beard couldn't hide the cruel set of his mouth, lips that had issued countless orders for punishment and pain. But this morning something was wrong. Terribly, horrifically wrong. Where the overseer quarters should have stood, a long two-story wooden building that housed 40 of his most trusted enforcers, only blackened timber and smoldering ash remained. Gray smoke still curled upward, like ghostly fingers reaching toward heaven, or perhaps clawing desperately away from hell. "Sweet, merciful Christ," Whitmore whispered, his face draining of color as he stumbled down the veranda steps. His polished boots crunched through debris as he approached what had once been the heart of his plantation's brutal efficiency. The morning dew had turned to steam where it touched the still warm ashes, creating an otherworldly mist that seemed to writhe and dance among the ruins. The iron window bars, twisted by the intense heat, jutted from the wreckage like the ribs of some massive burned beast. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. No groaning wounded, no survivors stumbling from the wreckage, just the soft whisper of settling ash and the distant song of mockingbirds, as if nature itself mocked the devastation. Whitmore's foreman, Jeremiah Blackwood, came running from the slave quarters, his face ashen. "Master Cornelius, I heard you shouting." The words died in his throat as he took in the scene before them. How many? Whitmore's voice was barely audible, his hands trembling as he gestured toward the ruins. "All of them, sir. All 40. Blackwood's voice cracked. "Barnabas Cromwell, Silas Hartwell, Montgomery Pike, every last overseer we had." The two men stood in stunned silence, the magnitude of the disaster slowly sinking in. 40 overseers, the iron backbone of their operation, reduced to ash and bone in a single night. How does an entire building burn to the ground without anyone raising an alarm? Without a single soul escaping? "The doors," Blackwood whispered, pointing with a shaking finger. "Look at the doors, Master Cornelius." Whitmore followed his gaze and felt ice flood his veins. The main entrance to the building had been barred from the outside. Heavy wooden beams, now charred but still recognizable, lay across what remained of the doorframe. The windows on the ground floor showed similar signs, boards nailed across them from outside the building. Someone did this, Whitmore breathed. Someone trapped them inside. The realization hit both men simultaneously. This wasn't an accident, this was murder. Mass murder on a scale that defied comprehension. As they stood among the ruins trying to process the horror before them, a soft voice interrupted their shock. "Your breakfast is ready, Master Cornelius." Both men spun around to find Tobias standing. Behind them, a silver tray balanced perfectly in his dark hands. Steam rose from the covered dishes and his white servant's jacket was immaculate, despite the ash that seemed to coat everything else within 100 yards of the ruins. Tobias was perhaps 30 years old, though his exact age, like that of most slaves, remained a mystery. He stood tall and lean, with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. His skin was the color of polished mahogany, and his movements possessed a fluid grace that spoke of careful breeding and education. As Whitmore's personal house slave, Tobias had been granted privileges that field hands could only dream of: fine clothes, education enough to read and write, and access to the main house that made him the envy and sometimes the suspicion of his fellow bondsmen. "Tobias," Whitmore stammered, Did you hear anything last night?" "No, sir," Tobias replied, his voice steady and respectful. "I slept soundly in the house, as always, though I did notice the unusual light when I rose to prepare your morning meal." He gestured with his free hand toward the smoldering ruins. "Most tragic, Master Cornelius. 40 good Christian souls lost. There was something in the way Tobias said good Christian souls that made Whitmore's skin crawl, though he couldn't quite place why. The words were appropriate, respectful even, but they seemed to carry a weight that didn't match their surface meaning. "We need to send for the sheriff," Blackwood muttered, wiping sweat and ash from his brow. "And the militia, if there's a killer, loose." "Of course," Whitmore agreed, though his eyes remained fixed on Tobias. Something about his slave's composure disturbed him. Any normal person would show shock, horror, fear, some reaction to the carnage before them. But Tobias stood as calm as if he were serving tea on a Sunday afternoon. "Shall I ring the bell to gather the field hands, Master Cornelius?" Tobias asked. "They'll want to know why there's no work detail being organized this morning." Yes, do that," Whitmore replied absently, "and send someone to town for Sheriff Haldane." "Of course, sir." Tobias turned to go, then paused. "Master Cornelius, your eggs are getting cold." With that, he glided away toward the house with that same unsettling grace, leaving the two white men standing among the ashes of what had been their reign of terror. 24 hours earlier, the previous morning had dawned much like any other at Magnolia Grove plantation. The sun rose like a malevolent eye over the sprawling fields of cotton and rice, promising another day of back-breaking labor under the merciless South Carolina heat. But for Tobias, this day carried a significance that no one else could have imagined. He had risen before dawn, as was his custom, moving silently through the big house like a specter in white linen. Master Cornelius preferred his breakfast at precisely 7 o'clock, his coffee black as sin and his eggs soft-boiled to perfection. These small rituals of service had become second nature to Tobias over his 15 years in the house, each movement practiced until it became an art form of invisible efficiency. But this morning, as he prepared the silver service in the kitchen, his hands moved with particular care. Each piece of china was positioned with mathematical precision, each fold of the linen napkin executed with deliberate attention. It was, after all, to be Master Cornelius's last breakfast served by Tobias's hand. The irony wasn't lost on him, that he was preparing this meal with the same oil he would use that night for far more sinister purposes. The lamp oil sat innocently on the kitchen shelf, waiting for darkness to fulfill its true destiny. Mrs. Evangeline, the plantation's head cook, bustled into the kitchen as Tobias was arranging the morning flowers, white magnolia blossoms that would, by tomorrow, be unable to mask the stench of death. "You're up early, even for you," she observed, her round face creased with the kind of permanent worry that came from a lifetime of trying to please masters who could never be pleased. "Couldn't sleep," Tobias replied truthfully. "Too much on my mind." Mrs. Evangeline nodded sympathetically. She was one of the few people on the plantation who treated Tobias with something approaching genuine affection, perhaps because they both occupied that strange middle ground between house and field, privileged enough to avoid the worst brutalities but never free enough to truly breathe. "The overseers were particularly loud last night," she commented, beginning her own morning preparations. "That Barnabas Cromwell especially. Heard him shouting at someone clear past midnight." Tobias's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Barnabas Cromwell. The name alone made his blood sing with barely contained rage. The man was a brute even by overseer standards, a sadist who took genuine pleasure in the suffering of others. Just 3 weeks ago, Tobias had watched from the kitchen window as Cromwell had beaten a pregnant slave woman named Celia for the crime of moving too slowly in her final month. The memory of her screams still echoed in his dreams. "Some men drink to forget their troubles," Tobias said quietly. "Others drink to remember their power." Wise words. Mrs. Evangeline agreed, though she missed the dark undertone in his voice. "You always were too thoughtful for your own good, Tobias. Sometimes I wonder what goes on in that head of yours." If she only knew, Tobias thought. If she could see the detailed maps he'd drawn of the overseer quarters, the careful notes about sleeping arrangements and drinking habits, the precise calculations of wind direction and fire spread, If she could witness the cold fury that had been building in his chest for 15 years, fed by 1,000 small cruelties and a handful of unforgivable atrocities. But she would never know. None of them would, until it was far too late. If you're enjoying this dark tale, please subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think will happen next. As the morning progressed, Tobias moved through his duties with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. He served Master Cornelius his breakfast on the veranda, standing silently as the man consumed his meal and planned another day of human misery. He cleaned the master's study, carefully noting the position of certain items he would need to replace after tonight's work was done. He even exchanged pleasantries with some of the overseers as they organized the day's work details, his voice steady and respectful while his mind catalogued their sins. By evening, as the last light faded from the sky and the plantation settled into its nightly routine, Tobias felt a strange sense of peace descend upon him. The decision had been made months ago. The planning had been completed weeks ago. Tonight was simply the culmination of a very long and very patient journey toward justice. As he performed his final service of the day, snuffing the candles in Master Cornelius's bedroom and ensuring his comfort for the night, Tobias allowed himself one last look at the man who had owned his body for 15 years, but had never managed to break his spirit. "Sleep well, Master Cornelius," he whispered in the darkness. "Tomorrow you'll wake to a very different world." Then he slipped from the house like a shadow, his work far from over. The real labor of this night was just beginning. 3 weeks before the burning, the scream that shattered the humid afternoon air of June 23, 1822, would echo in Tobias's mind for the rest of his life, however long or short that life might prove to be. He stood at the kitchen window of the big house, silver teapot frozen in his hands, watching as Overseer Barnabas Cromwell raised his leather whip for another strike against the swollen belly of Celia, a field hand 8 months heavy with child. "Please, Master Barnabas," Celia's voice cracked with desperation as she tried to shield her unborn child. "I can't move any faster. The baby don't pick my cotton." Cromwell's voice boomed across the yard, thick with whiskey and malice. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6.5 feet tall with arms like tree trunks and a face that seemed carved from granite and cruelty. His pale eyes held no mercy as he brought the whip down again, the crack of leather against flesh audible even through the kitchen window. Tobias felt something fundamental snap inside his chest. Not break, but transform. Like iron heated in a forge until it became something harder, deadlier. For 15 years he had witnessed countless acts of brutality, had learned to school his features into the mask of servile acceptance that kept him alive. But this transcended even the casual evil he had come to expect from the overseers of Magnolia Grove. Mrs. Evangeline appeared beside him at the window, her face pale with horror. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered. "Someone needs to stop him." But Tobias knew no one would stop Barnabas Cromwell. Not Master Cornelius, who was conducting business in Charleston, not the other overseers, who saw such displays as necessary entertainment, not the field hands who would only earn themselves a taste of the same medicine, and certainly not Tobias, whose privileged position in the house depended on his ability to remain invisible, useful, and above all, silent. The whipping continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When Cromwell finally tired of his sport, Celia lay crumpled in the red dirt, her dress torn and bloodied, her hands still protectively curved around her belly. 2 other slave women rushed to help her, their faces masks of controlled terror. "Next time, move faster," Cromwell spat, coiling his whip with practiced ease. "I don't care if you're carrying Jesus Christ himself, you work at my pace, not yours." As the overseer swaggered away toward the quarters where he and his fellow demons would drink away the afternoon, Tobias made a decision that would doom 40 men and transform him from house slave to angel of death. He would kill them all. The thought should have horrified him. Instead, it settled into his mind with the calm certainty of divine revelation. For too long he had watched, waited, and hoped that somehow the system would correct itself, that mercy would temper brutality, that human decency would eventually triumph over human evil. But Celia's screams had burned away those naive hopes. like morning mist before the sun. That night, as the plantation settled into its usual rhythm of exhausted sleep, Tobias began his work in earnest. Not the work of murder, not yet, but the work of understanding. If he was going to kill 40 men, he needed to know everything about them, their habits, their weaknesses, their fears, and most importantly, their routines. He started with what he already knew from 15 years of careful observation. The overseers lived in a long 2-story building, constructed specifically to house Magnolia Grove's small army of enforcers. Built of pine and oak, the structure was designed more for efficiency than comfort, with narrow hallways, small windows, and thin walls that allowed sound to carry between rooms. Most of the overseers slept on the ground floor, while the more senior men, like Cromwell and his lieutenant Silas Hartwell, occupied the larger rooms upstairs. The building had 4 exits, the main door facing the big house, a side door near the kitchen area, and 2 windows on each floor that could serve as emergency exits. But Tobias had noticed something else during his years of invisible service, something the overseers themselves had probably forgotten. The building had been constructed with security in mind, designed to keep potential slave uprisings from reaching the men who enforced the plantation's brutal order. Iron bars covered the windows, and heavy wooden doors could be barred from the outside in case of emergency. What had been designed to keep danger out could just as easily keep the danger. And over the following weeks, Tobias began a campaign of careful intelligence gathering that would have impressed a military strategist. He volunteered for extra duties that would take him near the overseer quarters, always with a legitimate reason, always with the proper demeanor of servile helpfulness. He learned which men were heavy sleepers and which were light, who drank, themselves unconscious every night, and who might wake at the first sign of trouble. Barnabas Cromwell, he discovered, was a creature of rigid habit. Every evening after dinner, he would drink precisely 3 glasses of whiskey while reading his Bible, a perversion that made Tobias's skin crawl. By 10 o'clock, Cromwell would be unconscious in his bed, snoring like a freight train until dawn. The irony that such a godless man should fall asleep reading scripture wasn't lost on Tobias. It seemed fitting that Cromwell would meet his maker with the good book still fresh in his whiskey-addled mind. Silas Hartwell, Cromwell's second-in-command, presented a different challenge. The man was paranoid by nature, sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow and a knife within arm's reach. But Hartwell had one weakness that Tobias could exploit: laudanum. The overseer had developed a dependency on the opiate after a riding accident 2 years earlier, and on nights when his old injuries flared up, he would dose himself into a stupor that made even Cromwell's drunken sleep seem light by comparison. Montgomery, Pike, the youngest of the senior overseers at barely 25, was perhaps the most dangerous because he was the most unpredictable. Sometimes he would carouse with his fellows until the early hours of morning. Other nights he would retire early and read by candlelight until midnight. But Pike had recently taken up with a slave woman named Delilah from the Hartwell plantation 5 miles down the river, and on the nights when he visited her, he wouldn't return until just before dawn, drunk, exhausted, and vulnerable. As Tobias catalogued the habits and weaknesses of each overseer, he began to see the pattern of their evil with crystalline clarity. These weren't merely crude men doing a difficult job. They were sadists who had found a socially acceptable outlet for their darkest impulses. Cromwell took pleasure in breaking the spirits of pregnant women. Hartwell specialized in psychological torture, convincing slaves that their children would be sold away if they didn't meet impossible quotas. Pike, for all his youth, had already earned a reputation for creative punishments that left permanent scars without reducing a slave's ability to work. And these were just 3 of the 40 men Tobias planned to consign to flames, but knowledge alone wouldn't be enough. He needed resources, timing, and most importantly, a method that would ensure none of his targets could escape their fate. Fire was the obvious choice. It was dramatic, purifying, and above all, democratic in its hunger. Fire didn't care about a man's position or power. It consumed everything in its path with equal appetite. The challenge lay in acquiring the materials he would need without arousing suspicion. Lamp oil was readily available in the big house. but taking too much at once would be noticed. Instead, Tobias began a careful campaign of conservation, claiming that some lamps had been extinguished early or that certain rooms hadn't needed illumination. Drop by drop, ounce by ounce, he accumulated his instruments of destruction. He also needed to study the wind patterns around the overseer quarters. Too much wind and the fire might spread to other buildings, potentially killing innocent slaves or destroying valuable property that Master Cornelius would expect to inherit from his overseer's quarters. Too little wind and the fire might burn too slowly, giving some of the men a chance to escape or raise an alarm. Night after night, Tobias would stand in the shadows near the overseer building, noting the direction and strength of the evening breezes. He learned that the wind typically shifted around midnight, blowing from the southwest toward the northeast. Perfect for containing a fire to the overseer quarters while keeping it away from the slave cabins in the big house. As his plans took shape, Tobias found himself experiencing a strange kind of peace. For the first time in 15 years, he had a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. He wasn't just enduring his bondage anymore. He was actively working toward a resolution that would bring justice to the innocent and punishment to the guilty. The transformation wasn't just psychological, it was spiritual. Tobias had been raised in the Christian faith, taught to turn the other cheek and trust in divine justice. But as he watched Celia struggle to walk in the days following her beating, as he saw other slaves suffer under the casual cruelty of their overseers, he began to understand that sometimes divine justice required human hands to execute it. He was becoming the instrument of God's wrath, and the thought filled him not with horror but with righteous purpose. The final piece of his plan came to him during the last week of June, as he observed the overseer's evening routine from the kitchen window. Every night they would gather in the main room of their quarters for dinner, drinking, and the kind of crude entertainment that would have horrified civilized society. By 10 o'clock, most would have staggered to their beds, leaving only the night's designated watchman to maintain some semblance of security. But Tobias had noticed something else. The night watchman always made his rounds starting from the slave quarters and working his way back toward the big house, a circuit that took him away from the overseer building for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes would be more than enough time for a determined man with the right materials to seal every exit and ensure that 40 evil souls would never see another sunrise. As July arrived and Tobias put the finishing touches on his plan, he felt a profound sense of completeness. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, every moral justification examined and found sufficient. He would not be committing murder. He would be executing justice. He would not be destroying innocent lives. He would be ending evil ones. He would not be acting out of personal hatred. He would be serving as the hand of divine retribution. The only question that remained was when to act. The answer came to him on the evening of July 13th, as he watched Cromwell stagger toward the overseer quarters after another day of casual brutality. The man was drunk, as usual, but tonight he seemed particularly pleased with himself. Earlier that day, he had ordered 20 lashes for a field hand who had dared to request water during the hottest part of the afternoon. 20 lashes for asking for water. Even by the standards of Magnolia Grove plantation, it was an act of exceptional cruelty. It was also, Tobias realized, a sign. Divine providence was telling him that the time for patience had ended. Tomorrow night he would begin his work of holy vengeance. Tomorrow night, 40 overseers would learn the true meaning of justice. And tomorrow morning the world would wake to discover that sometimes the meek do more than inherit the earth. Sometimes they cleanse it with fire. As he made his final preparations, Tobias felt no fear, no doubt, no regret. He felt only the serene confidence of a man who had found his true calling. He was no longer Tobias the house slave, invisible and powerless. He had become something far more dangerous and infinitely more righteous. He had become justice incarnate, and woe unto those who had earned his attention. July 13th, 1822. The day before. The morning of July 13th dawned with an oppressive stillness that seemed to press down on Magnolia Grove plantation like the lid of a coffin. The air hung thick and motionless, pregnant with the promise of thunder that never came. Even the mockingbirds, usually eager to fill the pre-dawn hours with their stolen songs, remained silent in the ancient live oaks that bordered the plantation grounds. Tobias moved through the big house like a specter, his every action deliberate and measured. To any observer, he appeared to be following his usual morning routine, preparing Master Cornelius's breakfast, dusting the parlor furniture, arranging fresh magnolia blossoms in the crystal vases. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, every gesture served a darker purpose. In the kitchen, as he ground the coffee beans with mechanical precision, Tobias mentally rehearsed the evening's work for the 100th time. The lamp oil he had accumulated over the past 3 weeks was hidden in a burlap sack beneath the loose floorboard behind the pantry. 12 precious quarts of clear, volatile liquid that would serve as his paintbrush for tonight's masterpiece of destruction. "You're quieter than usual this morning," Mrs. Evangeline observed as she kneaded dough for the day's bread. Her round face showed concern, the kind of maternal worry that had made her the unofficial mother figure for the house slaves. "Something troubling your mind?" Tobias paused in his grinding, considering his response carefully. Mrs. Evangeline had been kind to him over the years, one of the few people on the plantation who treated him as something approaching human. The thought of her discovering his role in tomorrow's carnage caused him a moment's discomfort. Not guilt, but a shadow of regret that she would have to live with the knowledge of what he had become. "Just thinking about the future," he replied, which was true enough. Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has to decide who he really is. She nodded thoughtfully, perhaps sensing deeper currents in his words, but lacking the context to understand their true meaning. "Well, whatever's weighing on you, remember that the Lord works in mysterious ways. Sometimes what seems like an ending is really a beginning." If she only knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. As the morning progressed, Tobias found himself studying the overseer quarters with new eyes, seeing not a building but a puzzle box that he would soon unlock with fire and death. The structure sat approximately 100 yards from the big house, positioned to give the overseers a clear view of both the slave quarters and the main residence. Its isolation, designed to provide privacy for the men who enforced the plantation's brutal order, would tonight become the instrument of their doom. The building's weaknesses, which Tobias had catalogued over weeks of careful observation, seemed almost to glow in the morning light. The single water barrel positioned near the front entrance would be easily emptied. The wooden shutters that could be latched from outside would trap any man who tried to escape through the windows. The heavy oak timbers that braced the main door could be repositioned to create an impenetrable barrier. But it was the building's greatest strength, its isolation from the rest of the plantation, that would prove to be its ultimate vulnerability. When the screams began, they would echo across empty space before reaching ears that might offer help. And by then it would be far too late. Around midday, as the sun reached its merciless peak and the field hands began their brief respite from labor, Tobias made his way to the overseer quarters on the pretext of delivering a message from Master Cornelius. The building's interior was a symphony of masculine squalor. Unwashed bodies, stale whiskey, and the peculiar odor of men who believed their authority exempted them from civilized behavior. Barnabas Cromwell sat at the main table, cleaning his pistol with the methodical care of a man who viewed violence as both profession and passion. His massive frame dwarfed the wooden chair, and his pale eyes tracked Tobias's movement with the lazy attention of a predator watching potential prey. "What's old Cornelius want now?" Cromwell's voice carried the rasp of a man who had spent years shouting orders over the sounds of human suffering. "Master Cornelius requests that you review the work assignments for tomorrow's cotton picking," Tobias replied, extending a folded paper with precisely the right degree of deference. "He's expecting visitors from Savannah and wants to ensure maximum productivity." Cromwell grunted and snatched the paper, his thick fingers leaving grease stains on the pristine surface. As he read, Tobias allowed his gaze to wander, committing final details to memory. The arrangement of furniture that would determine how quickly flames spread from room to room. The position of oil lamps that could be overturned to accelerate the fire's hunger. The bottles of corn whiskey that would explode like grenades when the heat reached them. "Tell Cornelius we'll have his cotton picked," Cromwell said, wadding up the paper and tossing it toward a corner where it would later serve as kindling for a very different purpose. The niggers know better than to slack off when I'm watching. Of course, Master Barnabas, Tobias replied, though internally he savored the knowledge that Cromwell would never watch another soul suffer. Tonight, the overseer would learn what it felt like to be trapped, helpless, and burning. As he turned to leave, Tobias's attention was caught by a new addition to the quarters, a heavy wooden bar propped against the wall near the main door. One of the overseers had apparently installed it as an additional security measure, a way to bar the entrance from inside against potential slave uprisings. The irony was exquisite. The very device intended to keep the overseers safe would tonight become the instrument of their destruction. Tobias filed this information away with quiet satisfaction, another element falling perfectly into place in his grand design. The afternoon hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, each minute bringing him closer to the moment when theoretical planning would become bloody reality. Tobias performed his duties with mechanical efficiency. Part of his mind focused on the mundane tasks of service while another part rehearsed the evening's deadly choreography. At precisely 3 o'clock, he retrieved the burlap sack containing his accumulated lamp oil from its hiding place beneath the pantry floor. The weight of it, perhaps 20 pounds of liquid destruction, felt almost ceremonial in his hands. He carefully transferred the oil to smaller containers, ceramic jugs that could be concealed beneath his clothing, metal flasks that would fit in the pockets of his work coat, even a small vial that he secured in his boot. Each container was a brushstroke in the masterpiece he would paint across the overseer quarters. Applied correctly, they would transform the building from a haven of brutality into a furnace of justice. As evening approached, Tobias found himself experiencing a strange duality of emotion. On the surface, he maintained the calm demeanor that had served him well throughout 15 years of bondage. But beneath that practiced serenity, something primal and terrible was awakening. A dark joy that whispered promises of retribution and spoke in tongues of fire. He thought of Celia, still walking gingerly 3 weeks after her beating, her unborn child moving less frequently than before. He thought of Moses, a field hand who had been sold away from his family for the crime of learning to read. He thought of Rebecca, barely 16, who had been passed around among the overseers like a bottle of whiskey, until her spirit finally shattered completely. Each memory fed the fire building in his chest, a conflagration that would soon find physical expression in wood and flesh and screaming that would echo across Charleston County. Dinner in the big house proceeded with surreal normalcy. Master Cornelius discussed his plans for expanding the plantation's rice production, seemingly oblivious to the fact that by morning, he would have no overseers left to implement his schemes. Tobias served the meal with his usual invisible efficiency, refilling wine glasses and removing plates while mentally calculating wind speeds and burn rates. Tobias, Master Cornelius said as the meal concluded, make sure the overseer quarters are well lit tonight. I want no complaints about inadequate lighting when Sheriff Haldane visits tomorrow. Of course, Master Cornelius, Tobias replied, and he meant it more literally than his owner could possibly imagine. The overseer quarters would indeed be brilliantly illuminated, with flames that would be visible for miles. If you're enjoying this tale of vengeance and dark justice, please subscribe and comment with your thoughts on what drives a man to such extremes. As the last light faded from the western sky and Magnolia Grove settled into its evening rhythm, Tobias began his final preparations. He changed from his house servant's livery into darker clothing that would blend with the shadows. Black trousers, a dark gray shirt, and soft-soled shoes that would make no sound on gravel or wood. The tools of his trade were distributed about his person with the care of a surgeon arranging instruments. The ceramic jugs of oil were secured beneath his loose-fitting coat, their weight balanced to avoid detection. A small hand axe, borrowed from the kitchen and supposedly needed for splitting kindling, was tucked into his belt. Most importantly, he carried a steel flint and striker wrapped in oiled cloth, the spark that would ignite his revolution. At precisely 9 o'clock, as the overseer quarters settled into their usual evening routine of drinking and crude entertainment. Tobias slipped from the big house through the kitchen door. The night was warm and humid, with just enough breeze to carry flames but not enough to spread them beyond his intended target. He moved through the darkness like a hunting cat, every sense attuned to potential threats. The night watchman was beginning his rounds from the slave quarters, following the predictable pattern that Tobias had observed for weeks. This gave him a window of opportunity that would open at 10:15 and close by 10:30. 15 minutes to transform 40 sleeping men into fuel for the fires of justice. As he approached the overseer quarters, Tobias could hear the familiar sounds of evening debauchery filtering through the thin walls. Loud voices arguing over card games, the clink of whiskey bottles, crude laughter at jokes too vile to be repeated in civilized company. These were the sounds of men who believed themselves untouchable, protected by the color of their skin and the power of their positions. They were about to learn how quickly power could burn. Tobias positioned himself in the shadow of a large magnolia tree, close enough to observe the building but far enough away to avoid casual detection. From this vantage point, he could see light spilling from several windows on both floors, silhouetting his targets as they moved about in blissful ignorance of their approaching doom. One by one, he watched the lights extinguish as the overseers retired to their beds. First, the main room went dark as the communal drinking session ended. Then the individual rooms followed suit, some quickly as exhausted men collapsed onto their bunks, others more slowly as the more disciplined overseers prepared for sleep with military precision. By 10 o'clock, only 3 windows still showed light. By 10:15, all was darkness save for the faint glow of banked embers in the main room's fireplace. It was time. Tobias emerged from his hiding place like death itself, moving with purpose toward the building that housed his enemies. The weight of the oil containers seemed to disappear as adrenaline flooded his system, replacing conscious thought with pure, focused intention. The first task was securing the exits. The side door near the kitchen area received his initial attention. A heavy wooden beam, conveniently left nearby for construction work, was easily positioned to bar the door from outside. The main entrance required more creativity, but the security bar that Cromwell had installed proved perfectly suited to Tobias's purposes when repositioned to prevent rather than enable opening. As he worked, distributing oil around the building's perimeter with the precision of an artist, Tobias felt the last vestiges of his humanity slip away. He was no longer a man, but an instrument of divine justice, a scythe in the hands of fate cutting down the weeds that had grown too tall. The time for mercy had passed, the time for justice had begun, and somewhere in the darkness 40 men slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that they would never wake again. July 13th, 1822, 10:37 p.m. The overseer quarters stood silent in the suffocating darkness, a monument to sleeping evil that would soon become a cathedral of flame. Tobias moved around its perimeter like a priest preparing a sacred ritual, each step deliberate, each action imbued with the terrible purpose that had consumed his soul over the past 3 weeks. The night air hung motionless, as if the very atmosphere held its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Not even the cicadas dared to break the silence with their summer symphony. It was as though nature itself recognized that something momentous was about to unfold, something that would forever alter the balance between the powerful and the powerless. Tobias had completed his circuit of the building, ensuring that every exit was secured, every escape route sealed. The heavy wooden beams now barred both the main door and the side entrance with the finality of tombstones. The windows, already protected by iron bars designed to keep intruders out, had been reinforced with additional boards nailed into place from the outside. What had been built as a fortress to protect the plantation's enforcers had become their mausoleum. From within the building came the sounds of deep, peaceful sleep, snoring that spoke of men secure in their power, comfortable in their cruelty, and utterly oblivious to the judgment that stalked them in the darkness. Barnabas Cromwell's rumbling bass notes dominated the symphony, his massive frame shaking the very timbers of his upstairs room. Silas Hartwell's breathing carried the shallow rhythm of laudanum-induced stupor. Montgomery Pike, recently returned from his nocturnal visit to the Hartwell plantation, had collapsed into his bed still wearing his boots. 40 men in total, each one a willing participant in the machinery of human suffering that ground souls to dust beneath the wheels of cotton and rice production. Tonight, they would learn what it felt like to be helpless, to be trapped, to face death with no hope of escape or mercy. Tobias withdrew the first ceramic jug of lamp oil from beneath his coat, feeling its weight like a communion chalice in his hands. The oil gleamed pale silver in the faint starlight, innocent as water but infinitely more dangerous. He had calculated the quantities with mathematical precision, enough to ensure rapid ignition and sustained burning, but not so much as to create an explosion that might damage neighboring structures or harm innocent slaves. He began at the eastern corner of the building, pouring a steady stream of oil along the wooden foundation. The liquid soaked into the dry pine boards with eager hunger, disappearing into the grain of the wood like blood into parched earth. As he moved along the building's perimeter, Tobias found himself cataloging the men inside, matching names to the sins that had earned them their place in this night's terrible arithmetic. Room by room, soul by soul, he pronounced their sentences in the darkness. Augustus Fairfax, he whispered as he doused the wall beneath a first-floor window, who branded the letter R for runaway into the face of 12-year-old Samuel when the boy tried to visit his dying mother on the neighboring plantation. The now. Oil gurgled softly as it left the jug, a sound like whispered prayers or dying breath. Jeremiah Whitlock, who forced Rebecca to choose which of her 3 children would be sold to pay for his gambling debts, then sold all 3 when she couldn't decide. Another section of wall received its baptism of combustible judgment. Nathaniel Cross, who broke both of old Moses's hands with a hammer for teaching slave children their letters, claiming that education made field hands uppity and dangerous. Each name brought with it a cascade of memories. Beatings witnessed, families destroyed, dignity trampled beneath boots that would soon dance in flames. Tobias felt no hatred for these men anymore. Hatred was too small an emotion for what they had earned. What filled his chest now was something purer and more terrible, the cold fire of absolute justice. As he rounded the corner to the building's southern wall, a window on the second floor caught his attention. Behind the glass, silhouetted by faint moonlight, he could see the massive bulk of Barnabas Cromwell sprawled across his bed. Even in sleep, the overseer's face bore the cruel lines that had been carved by years of casual brutality. His mouth hung open, releasing the thunderous snores that had become his signature sound throughout the plantation. For a moment, Tobias allowed himself to imagine Cromwell's awakening, the confusion as smoke filled his lungs, the growing terror. As he realized the building was burning around him, the desperate scramble toward windows and doors that would no longer open. The thought brought not satisfaction but a profound sense of completion, as if a broken bone were finally being properly set. Barnabas Cromwell, he said, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute conviction, who beat pregnant Celia for the crime of moving slowly while carrying new life, who laughed as she begged for mercy for her unborn child, who called her baby future cotton-picking stock as he raised his whip for another strike. The oil beneath Cromwell's window received an extra measure, ensuring that the flames would reach him first and burn brightest beneath his feet. The western wall of the building faced the slave quarters, and as Tobias worked his way along its length, he was acutely aware that behind him, in their cramped cabins, his fellow bondsmen slept the exhausted sleep of those who would wake to another day of toil. They would be safe from tonight's fire. He had calculated wind direction and flame spread with the precision of an engineer, but they would not be safe from the consequences. Come morning, when the ashes had cooled and the investigations began, suspicion would fall heavily on the slave population. Some might be questioned, others punished, a few perhaps even executed as examples. The thought pained Tobias, but it could not deter him from his mission. The overseer's deaths would save hundreds of future victims, even if it cost a few innocent lives in the aftermath. Sometimes justice demanded sacrifice from the innocent as well as the guilty. As he approached the northern wall, the final side of his circuit, Tobias felt time stretching and compressing around him like heated metal. Minutes felt like hours, yet the entire operation had taken less than 10 minutes. His movements remained steady and deliberate, but internally he was beginning to feel the weight of what he was about to unleash. This was no longer theoretical, planning, or righteous anger. In moments he would strike the flint, ignite the oil, and transform 40 sleeping men into screaming torches. There would be no way to undo what followed, no possibility of mercy or reprieve. Once the spark jumped from steel to tinder, Tobias would cross a line that separated the civilized from the savage, the victim from the executioner. The realization should have given him pause. Instead, it filled him with a sense of profound liberation. For 15 years, he had been forced to swallow his dignity, his anger, his very humanity. Tonight he would vomit it all back up in flames and smoke and the screams of burning overseers. The final jug of oil was reserved for the main entrance, where Tobias had barred the heavy oak door with the overseer's own security beam. He poured the liquid with ceremonial care, creating a pool of potential fire that would ensure no one could escape through the building's primary exit. The oil spread across the wooden planking like a blessing or a curse, depending on one's perspective. From inside the building came a sound that made Tobias freeze, footsteps moving across a wooden floor. Someone was awake, moving around, perhaps heading toward one of the sealed exits. For a heart-stopping moment, he imagined his entire plan unraveling as an alert overseer discovered the barred doors and raised an alarm. But the footsteps were unsteady, staggering, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of someone relieving himself into a chamber pot. Just a drunk man answering nature's call before returning to bed. Within minutes, the movement ceased, replaced once again by the steady rhythm of snoring. The interruption served as a reminder that time was not unlimited. The night watchman would complete his circuit within minutes, and dawn was still hours away. If Tobias was going to act, it had to be now, while darkness still cloaked his movements and sleep still held his enemies defenseless. He withdrew the steel flint and striker from his coat pocket, feeling their cold weight against his palm. Such simple tools to serve such a momentous purpose. A few pieces of metal that would reshape the power structure of Magnolia Grove plantation forever. In the hands of most men, they were merely implements for lighting candles or starting cooking fires. In Tobias's hands, they had become the instruments of divine retribution. Moving to the eastern corner where he had begun his oil distribution, Tobias knelt beside a small pile of tinder he had prepared, dry pine needles, Spanish moss, and fragments of the message he had delivered to Cromwell that afternoon. The paper was stained with the overseer's greasy fingerprints, an irony that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. He struck the flint against the steel once, twice, 3 times. Each spark that jumped between the metal surfaces seemed to hang in the air like a fallen star, beautiful and terrible in its potential. On the 4th strike, a spark caught the tinder, sending up a tiny tongue of flame that danced in the still air like a living thing. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Tobias stared into that small fire and saw reflected there all the larger fires it would birth. He saw the oil igniting in long rivers of flame that would race around the building's perimeter. He saw the wooden walls catching fire, the flames climbing toward the 2nd floor where the senior overseers slept. He saw windows glowing like the eyes of demons as the interior filled with smoke and heat and the screams of dying men. He saw justice. The burning tinder fell from his hand onto the oil-soaked foundation of the overseer quarters, and the transformation was instantaneous. The flame spread along the building's base like a living thing awakening from long slumber, racing around corners and leaping between wooden boards with an eagerness that seemed almost sentient. Within seconds, the entire foundation was ablaze, and the fire began its inexorable climb toward the sleeping men above. The dry wood, seasoned by 2 summers of brutal heat, caught fire as easily as paper, and the building's interior began to glow with the warm light of approaching doom. From within came the first confused stirrings as sleeping men began to wake, to smoke and heat and the growing roar of flames. Voices called out in confusion, then alarm, then terror as the reality of their situation became clear. Tobias stepped back from the building, watching his work unfold with the detached fascination of an artist observing his masterpiece come to life. The fire was beautiful in its terrible purpose, illuminating the night with dancing shadows and painting the slave quarters in shades of gold and crimson. 40 men were about to die, and Tobias felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a job well done. The hour of judgment had arrived, and there would be no mercy for those who had shown none to others. July 13th to 14th, 1822, 10:45 p.m. The fire came alive with a hunger that seemed almost supernatural, devouring the oil-soaked foundation of the overseer quarters, with the eagerness of a starving beast finally presented with meat. What had begun as a small flame dancing among pine needles had transformed within minutes into a living wall of destruction that painted the Charleston night in shades of orange and gold. Tobias stood 30 yards away, positioned behind the massive trunk of a centuries-old live oak, watching his masterpiece unfold with the fascination of a conductor, leading a symphony of destruction. The flames climbed the building's wooden walls with impossible speed, finding purchase in every crack, every joint, every vulnerable seam where dry timber met seasoned pine. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard, not the cheerful crackle of a hearth fire or the controlled roar of a blacksmith's forge, but something primal and terrifying, like the breathing of some enormous dragon awakening from ancient slumber. The fire whispered and hissed as it consumed paint and wood, then roared with triumph as it found the whiskey bottles stored throughout the building, each explosion adding new fuel to its impossible appetite. From within the burning structure came the first human sounds, confused shouts, the thunder of boots on wooden floors, and then the terrible realization that would haunt Tobias's dreams for whatever remained of his life. The sound of men discovering that every exit had been sealed. "The door won't open!" The voice belonged to Ezra Thornfield, a junior overseer from Virginia whose specialty was breaking the spirits of field hands through systematic humiliation. "Something's blocking it from outside." "The windows." That was Montgomery Pike, his voice already strained from smoke inhalation. "Try the windows." The sound of glass shattering echoed across the plantation grounds as desperate men attempted to escape through openings that had been secured with iron bars and wooden boards. Tobias had planned for this moment, had known that the windows would provide false hope before revealing themselves to be merely another element of his carefully constructed trap. "We're trapped!" The scream came from upstairs where the senior overseers were now fully awake and beginning to comprehend the full scope of their predicament. "Someone's barred us in. Help! Help us!" Their cries for assistance carried across the plantation grounds, but Tobias knew that help was impossibly far away. The slave quarters were occupied by people who had been conditioned never to interfere with overseer business, even if that business was dying. The big house was too distant, and Master Cornelius slept the deep sleep of a man who had consumed an entire bottle of port with his evening meal. Even if someone did respond to the screams, it would take precious minutes to organize a rescue. Effort and minutes were a luxury that the burning men no longer possessed. The fire had now consumed the entire first floor, transforming what had been individual rooms into a single chamber of hell. Through the glowing windows, Tobias could see silhouettes moving frantically, men stumbling through smoke so thick it seemed solid, searching desperately for escape routes that no longer existed. Barnabas Cromwell's voice boomed above the chaos, still carrying the authority that had made him the plantation's most feared enforcer. "Form a line! Break down the main door! Use your shoulders, damn you!" Tobias almost smiled at the futility of the order. The main door had been reinforced with a wooden beam as thick as a man's torso, positioned in such a way that pushing from inside would only wedge it more securely in place. Cromwell was organizing his men to participate in their own destruction, using their strength to ensure their doom. The sound of bodies slamming against the barred door carried clearly through. The roar of flames, a rhythmic pounding that spoke of desperate men throwing themselves against an immovable obstacle. Once, twice, a dozen times they struck the door, each impact growing weaker as smoke filled their lungs and heat sapped their strength. "It's no use," someone screamed. "We need axes, tools, something to break through." But there were no tools inside the overseer quarters except for the instruments of their trade, whips, chains, branding irons, and other implements designed to inflict rather than construct. The irony was not lost on Tobias that these men, who had spent their careers wielding power over others, now found themselves powerless in the face of simple physics and carefully planned destruction. The second floor of the building was now fully engaged, flames shooting through the floorboards like eager fingers reaching for the men trapped above. Through the upstairs windows, Tobias could see the orange glow growing brighter as the fire found new fuel in bedding, clothing, and the personal effects of men who had thought themselves untouchable. Silas Hartwell appeared at one of the second-floor windows, his face a mask of terror and confusion as the laudanum haze cleared from his drug-addled brain. He pressed his face against the iron bars, his hands gripping the metal with white-knuckled desperation. "Please!" he screamed into the night. "Someone help us, we're burning alive!" The plea carried across the grounds with heart-rending intensity, but Tobias felt no stirring of mercy in his chest. This was the same man who had specialized in psychological torture, who had convinced countless slaves that their children would be sold away if they failed to meet impossible quotas. How many times had Hartwell ignored similar pleas for mercy? How many desperate voices had he silenced with his whip or his threats? Tonight his own desperate voice would go unanswered. The fire was now consuming the building's interior with systematic efficiency, working its way through each room like a methodical executioner. Tobias could track its progress by the changing pattern of light and shadow dancing across the plantation grounds. First the communal areas on the ground floor, then the individual sleeping quarters, and finally the upstairs rooms where the senior overseers had made their last stand. Augustus Fairfax appeared at another second-floor window, his nightshirt already smoldering from the heat. He had managed to break the glass but found himself facing the same iron bars that had been installed to protect the overseers from slave uprisings. Now those bars had become the final element in their destruction. "Can see someone out there," Fairfax shouted, his voice already hoarse from smoke. "You there, in the shadows. Help us, get tools, break down the doors." For a moment Tobias felt the weight of direct recognition, the possibility that his presence had been detected, but he remained motionless behind the oak tree, knowing that Fairfax was grasping at shadows, seeing rescue where none existed. The darkness was his ally, concealing him from the desperate eyes of dying men. The building's structural integrity was beginning to fail as the fire consumed the support beams and load-bearing timbers. A section of the roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending up a shower of sparks that danced like fireflies against the black sky. The sound was followed by renewed screaming from inside, voices raised in agony and terror as burning debris rained down on the trapped men. Jeremiah Whitlock's voice cut through the chaos, high and thin with panic. "The roof's coming down. We're going to be crushed." But Tobias knew that crushing would be a mercy compared to what actually awaited them. The fire was now hot enough to strip the moisture from human flesh, turning living men into fuel for its own continuation. Those who had not yet succumbed to smoke inhalation would soon discover that burning alive was a process of exquisite and prolonged torment. Through the windows, he could see shapes moving with decreasing frequency as the trapped men succumbed, one by one to heat, smoke, and flame. Some had collapsed where they stood, overcome by the poisonous gases that preceded the fire's advance. Others continued to move frantically, their silhouettes weaving and stumbling like drunken dancers in Hell's ballroom. Nathaniel Cross appeared briefly at a ground-floor window, his hands pressed against the glass as flames licked at his clothes. His mouth moved in what might have been prayers or curses. At this distance and through the distortion of heat and smoke, it was impossible to tell which. Then the flames reached him fully, and he disappeared back into the inferno's embrace. The sound from within the building was changing, evolving from human screams to something more primal and terrible. Men who had spent their lives asserting dominance through violence and intimidation were reduced to their most basic animal selves, howling with pain and terror as the fire claimed them piece by piece. Tobias found himself mesmerized by the transformation taking place before his eyes. The building that had housed 40 instruments of human suffering was becoming something else entirely. A furnace of justice, a cathedral of retribution, a monument to the proposition that even the most powerless could achieve terrible revenge if they possessed sufficient patience and determination. The heat was now so intense that he could feel it on his face even from 30 yards away, a dry wind that carried with it the smell of burning wood, melting metal, and something else that his mind refused to fully process. The fire had become a living thing, breathing in oxygen and exhaling destruction, consuming everything combustible and transforming it into light and heat and ash. A final, coordinated effort to break down the main door resulted in a crash that shook the entire building, but still the barrier held. The wooden beam that Tobias had positioned so carefully remained in place, sealed with the weight of desperate men who had unknowingly reinforced their own prison with every attempt to escape. The screaming was beginning to fade now, not from lack of will, but from lack of living voices to produce it. One by one, the shadows moving behind the windows grew still, claimed by smoke or flame or the simple failure of human flesh to withstand temperatures that belonged in a blacksmith's forge rather than a place where men slept. Barnabas Cromwell made one final appearance at his second-floor window, his massive frame silhouetted against the orange glow like some demon emerging from the pit. His clothes were gone, burned away, and his skin was already blackening from the heat, but his voice still carried across the plantation grounds with the authority that had made him feared throughout Charleston County. "I know someone did this," he roared into the night. "I know you're out there. You think this ends it? You think killing us solves anything? There'll be others. There'll always be others." His words carried the weight of prophecy, and Tobias knew they were true. Tomorrow, Master Cornelius would send to Charleston for new overseers. The system that ground human souls to dust would continue, perhaps with even greater brutality in response to this night's violence. The fire would not end slavery or transform the hearts of men who profited from human suffering. But it would end these 40 lives, and sometimes justice had to be satisfied with whatever victories it could claim. Cromwell's final scream cut through the night like a blade, a sound of such pure anguish that even Tobias felt something stir in his chest. Not regret, but recognition that he had just witnessed the destruction of something that had once been human, however corrupted it had become. Then silence fell over the burning building, broken only by the steady roar of flames consuming everything that remained. The overseer quarters of Magnolia Grove plantation had become a crematorium, and Tobias stood as its sole witness and architect. The fire would burn for another hour before collapsing completely into smoldering ruins. But Tobias's work was done. 40 men who had awakened this morning secure in their power and certain of their dominance would never see another dawn. Justice had been served with a thoroughness that would echo through Charleston County for generations to come. As he turned away from the burning building and began his careful journey back to the big house, Tobias felt a profound sense of completion settle over his soul. He had crossed a line tonight that could never be uncrossed, had become something that was neither slave nor free man but something else entirely, an agent of retribution, an instrument of divine justice, a living reminder that even the most powerless could achieve terrible things when driven to the breaking point. Tomorrow would bring consequences, investigations, and quite possibly his own death. But tonight belonged to justice, and justice had been thoroughly and completely served. The screams had ended, but their echo would haunt Magnolia Grove plantation until the last stone crumbled to dust. July 14th, 1822. Dawn and beyond, the first. Light of dawn revealed a landscape transformed by fire and death, as if hell itself had reached up through the earth to claim a portion of Magnolia Grove plantation. Where the overseer quarters had stood just hours before, only a blackened skeleton of timber and twisted metal remained, still exhaling ghostly tendrils of smoke into the humid morning air. Tobias stood on the kitchen steps of the big house, silver, breakfast tray balanced in his hands with the same steady precision he had demonstrated every morning for 15 years. But everything else had changed. The air carried the acrid stench of burned wood and something far more sinister that no amount of magnolia blossoms could mask. The very ground seemed different, baptized by fire and watered with the screams of dying men. Master Cornelius emerged from the big house in his silk dressing gown, his face still puffy with sleep and wine. The morning routine proceeded exactly as it had the day before. Coffee black as sin, eggs soft-boiled to perfection, the morning paper positioned at precisely the right angle beside his plate. But when Cornelius looked toward where his private army of enforcers should have been organizing the day's work details, his world collapsed into ash and horror. "Sweet, merciful Christ," Cornelius whispered, the words Tobias had heard him speak just hours earlier. The cycle was complete. The morning of discovery finally arrived. As Cornelius and his foreman Jeremiah Blackwood stumbled through the ruins, calling out names that would never again answer, Tobias maintained his facade of shocked servitude. He gasped at appropriate moments, shook his head in dismay when the full scope of the tragedy became clear, and offered assistance with the humble eagerness expected of a loyal house slave. But beneath his mask of concern, Tobias felt only the cold satisfaction of work well done. Sheriff Duncan Haldane arrived from Charleston within hours, bringing with him a contingent of militiamen and the kind of grim expertise that came from investigating plantation incidents. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with pale gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of a scene with mechanical precision. 40 men, Haldane murmured as he walked through the still warm ashes. All dead. Doors barred from outside, windows boarded shut. He turned to Cornelius with the expression of a man who had seen too much violence in his career. "This wasn't an accident, Cornelius. Someone murdered your overseers." The word hung in the air like smoke from the ruins. Murder. Not revenge, not justice, not divine retribution, but simple, criminal murder. Tobias found it fascinating how perspective could transform the same act from righteous to evil depending on who held the power to name it. But who? Cornelius's voice cracked with genuine bewilderment. Who could have done such a thing? And how did they manage to trap 40 armed men? Haldane's gaze swept across the assembled plantation population. Field hands, house slaves, artisans, and craftsmen all gathered to witness the investigation. His eyes lingered on each face, searching for some telltale sign of guilt or satisfaction that might betray the perpetrator. "Someone with access," he said finally. "Someone who knew the building's layout, the men's routines, their weaknesses. Someone who could move freely without arousing suspicion." Every eye turned toward the slave population, and Tobias felt the weight of collective suspicion settle over his people like a burial shroud. He had known this moment would come, had calculated it into his plans like wind direction and burn rates. The innocent would suffer for his actions, but their suffering would be temporary, while the justice he had delivered was eternal. The interrogations began immediately. One by one, slaves were questioned about their whereabouts the previous evening, their knowledge of the overseer quarters, their access to materials that could have started such a fire. Haldane was thorough and methodical, but he was also working within the constraints of a system that viewed slaves as property rather than people, capable of theft and destruction, perhaps, but not of the kind of sophisticated planning this crime had required. When Tobias's turn came, he presented himself with the perfect mixture of nervousness and cooperation that befitted an innocent man caught up in terrible circumstances. "I slept in the house, as always, Sheriff Haldane," he said, his voice properly deferential. "Master Cornelius requires his breakfast at 7 precisely, so I rose early to begin preparations. It was then that I noticed the unusual light from the direction of the quarters." "You heard nothing during the night? No sounds of struggle? No screams?" Tobias shook his head with genuine sadness. "The house is well built, sir. Sound doesn't carry easily through those thick walls. If the poor souls cried out, their voices never reached my ears. It was a masterful performance, truthful in every detail while concealing the most important truth of all." Haldane's questions continued for nearly an hour, probing for inconsistencies or signs of deception, but Tobias had spent 15 years perfecting the art of invisible service. His answers revealed nothing while appearing to reveal everything. As the investigation continued over the following days, a pattern emerged that filled Tobias with grim satisfaction. The authorities, constrained by their own assumptions about slave capabilities, found themselves chasing shadows and half-formed theories that led nowhere. Some suspected a conspiracy among multiple slaves, others proposed the involvement of abolitionists from the North, and a few even suggested that disgruntled overseers from neighboring plantations might have been responsible. But none seriously considered that a single house slave could have planned and executed such a sophisticated operation. Their prejudices had become their blindness, and their blindness was Tobias's protection. The psychological impact on the plantation was immediate and profound. Master Cornelius, robbed of his enforcement apparatus, found himself managing field hands who seemed somehow different, not openly rebellious, but subtly less responsive to commands, slower to obey, quicker to find excuses for reduced productivity. The balance of power that had seemed so absolute just days before had been shattered by flames and fear. New overseers began arriving from Charleston within a week, but they came now as frightened men rather than confident enforcers. They traveled in groups, slept with loaded weapons nearby, and jumped at shadows that might conceal another angel of death. The aura of invincibility that had once surrounded the plantation's white authority figures had been incinerated along with their predecessors. But it was among the slave population that the most significant changes occurred. In whispered conversations during brief rest periods, in glances exchanged across cotton fields, in the subtle body language of people who had learned to communicate without words, a new understanding was taking root. Someone had struck back. Someone had proven that the powerful were not untouchable, that justice could be claimed by those who had the courage and cunning to seize it. They didn't know who had done it. Tobias's secret remained his own. But they knew it had been done, and that knowledge changed everything. Mrs. Evangeline, the head cook, began to look at Tobias differently. Not with suspicion exactly, but with a new kind of awareness, as if she were seeing him clearly for the first time. During their morning preparations, she would sometimes pause in her work and study his face with searching eyes. "You've been different since the fire," she observed. One morning, 3 weeks after the burning, calmer somehow, more peaceful. "Death has a way of putting things in perspective," Tobias replied, which was true enough. "It reminds us how brief life is, how important it is to find meaning in our time here." She nodded thoughtfully, but her eyes remained thoughtful, calculating. Mrs. Evangeline had survived 30 years of plantation life by being observant, by reading the currents beneath the surface of daily routine. She might not know what Tobias had done, but she sensed that something fundamental had changed in him. As summer faded into autumn and the investigation gradually stalled for lack of evidence, Tobias found himself grappling with unexpected consequences of his actions. The satisfaction of revenge had been real and profound, but it was accompanied by something he hadn't anticipated: isolation. He had become a secret keeper of the most momentous kind, the sole witness to an act of justice that could never be acknowledged or celebrated. No one would ever know what he had accomplished. No one would ever thank him for the 40 monsters he had removed from the world. No one would ever understand the price he had paid for that justice. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps true. Justice was always a solitary burden, carried by those who were willing to sacrifice their own peace for the greater good. The dreams began in September, not nightmares exactly, but visitations. In his sleep, Tobias would find himself standing once again before the burning overseer quarters, watching flames consume the building while voices called out from within. But in the dreams, the voices were different. Instead of screams of terror and pain, he heard something else. Acknowledgement, understanding, even gratitude. "You did what had to be done," Barnabas Cromwell's voice would say, though when Tobias turned toward the sound, he saw not the brutal overseer, but something else. A figure made of smoke and ash and the lingering echoes of justice. "The innocent will remember," Silas Hartwell would whisper from the flames. "They will know that someone stood up for them when no one else would." "There will be others," Montgomery Pike would add, his voice carrying across the dream landscape, like wind through burned timbers. "Others who will remember this night and find the courage to act when their time comes." The dreams were neither comfort nor torment, but something more complex, a reminder that some actions transcend the simple categories of right and wrong, that justice sometimes requires ordinary people to become extraordinary, and that the price of such transformation is always paid in solitude. By Christmas of 1822, the investigation had been officially closed without resolution. The Charleston burning, as it came to be known in hushed conversations throughout the county, joined the catalog of plantation mysteries that would never be solved. Sheriff Haldane filed his final report, concluding that person or persons unknown had committed mass murder through arson, but that insufficient evidence existed to bring charges against any specific individual. Master Cornelius, meanwhile, had begun drinking more heavily and sleeping less soundly. The new overseers he had hired proved less effective than their predecessors. Whether from fear or from a subtle shift in the plantation's power dynamics was impossible to determine. Production declined, costs increased, and whispers began circulating in Charleston society about the wisdom of maintaining such large concentrations of troublesome slaves. Tobias continued his daily routine with the same invisible efficiency that had characterized his service for 15 years. He prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, served dinner, and maintained the facade of loyal servitude that kept him alive and undetected. But he was no longer the same man who had stood in the kitchen 3 weeks before the fire, watching Celia suffer under Cromwell's whip. He had become something new, not quite slave, not quite free, but something else entirely. He was a keeper of secrets, a dispenser of justice, a reminder that even the most powerless could achieve terrible things when driven to the breaking point. And sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, when the weight of what he had done settled over him like morning mist, Tobias would allow himself a moment of profound satisfaction. 40 evil men were dead because of his actions. 40 instruments of suffering had been removed from the world. 40 families would never again be torn apart by their cruelty. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all that justice could claim. The Charleston burning became legend, whispered about in slave quarters throughout the South as proof that the powerful were not invincible, that justice could still be found by those brave enough to claim it. The story grew in the telling, embellished with supernatural elements and divine intervention, until Tobias barely recognized his own actions in the tales that circulated among his people. But the core truth remained. Someone had stood up. Someone had said no. Someone had proven that even slaves could be dangerous when pushed too far. And in the big house of Magnolia Grove plantation, a quiet man in white linen continued to serve breakfast every morning at 7 o'clock precisely, carrying with him the knowledge that he had once set the world on fire and watched 40 devils burn. The secret would die with him, but the justice would live forever. If this tale of vengeance and retribution has captivated you, please subscribe for more dark stories from America's hidden history, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Tobias was a hero or a monster? What drives ordinary people to extraordinary acts of violence? Your thoughts fuel these explorations into the shadows of our past. Author's note: the Charleston burning of 1822 represents one of the most significant but least documented acts of slave resistance in American history. While the details of Tobias's story are dramatized for this telling, they reflect the very real tensions and brutalities that defined plantation life in the antebellum South. The questions raised by his actions about justice, revenge, and the moral complexity of resistance remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with the legacies of slavery and the ongoing struggle for human dignity and equality.